Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy examined and compared the spiritual teachings of both Jesus and pagans in their book, The Jesus Mysteries: Was the Original Jesus a Pagan God? They point out that most early Christians were aware that similarities existed between the two doctrines, as many had been educated in pagan philosophy. Both Christians and pagans focused upon the need for moral purity. Initiation into the mysteries was seen as a way to achieve purification and prepare for death, and Jesus also stressed the need to strive for moral purity in both thought, word, and deed. Jesus taught the need to confess sins, and this was also required of initiates into the mysteries as well. Even though many Christians claimed the adherents of the mystery schools were morally degenerate, this was not true. To the contrary, the goal of initiation was moral regeneration. Just as Jesus preached a new concept of a God of love, which was contrary to the traditional Jewish concept of a God of justice, mystery school initiates also stressed the importance of developing a personal relationship with the gods. These initiates also preached the doctrine of brotherly love, which is a concept that existed long before there were any Christians. In addition, Jesus taught followers to love all their neighbors, not just their fellow Christians, and even to love their enemies. This was also a key component of the ancient pagan mysteries. Socrates taught that, quote, "It is never right to do wrong, and never right to take revenge, nor is it right to give evil, or in the case of one who has suffered some injury, to attempt to get even," end quote. Another important teaching of Jesus that was originally taught by pagan philosophers had to do with humility and poverty. Freke and Gandy compare these teachings. Jesus sends out his disciples saying, "Go and announce that the kingdom of heaven is approaching. Cure the sick, raise the dead, wash lepers, throw out demons, accept free gifts, and give for free. Don't have gold, silver, or brass in your belts. Don't take a knapsack on the road, or a second tunic or shoes or a cane." The pagan cynic philosophers, who also traveled from place to place as they gave their spiritual teachings, bear a striking similarity. One scholar says, quote, "Among the familiar sights during the first century of the Roman Empire were the cynics wearing rough cloaks, carrying begging bags and thorn sticks. They used to wander from town to town, preaching to the people and hammering to their platitudes," end quote. The 2nd century Greek philosopher and opponent of Christianity, Celsus, accused Christians of copying the voluntary humility of these pagans. He writes, "Not surprisingly, they emphasize the virtue of humility, which in their case is to make a virtue of necessity. Here again, prostituting the noble ideas of Plato. Not only do they misunderstand the words of the philosophers, they even stoop to assigning words of the philosophers to their Jesus. For example, we are told that Jesus judged the rich with the saying, 'It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God.' Yet we know that Plato expressed this very idea in a pure form when he said, 'It is impossible for an exceptionally good man to be exceptionally rich.' Is one utterance more inspired than the other? The concept of heaven and hell is a central idea in the Gospels, but the notion of an afterlife was introduced to Greece from Egypt. Initiates in the mysteries, like the Christians, believed that those who were initiated and remained faithful would be reborn in eternity. Plutarch was a Greek Platonist philosopher, historian, biographer, essayist, and priest at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. Upon the death of his little daughter, Freke and Gandy tell us, he wrote a beautiful letter to his wife in which he reminded her that the mystic symbols of the rites of Dionysus are a source of comfort because they prevent one from thinking that the soul experiences nothing after death and ceases to be. He tells his wife that through their shared experience of the daughter's death and the revelations of Dionysus, they could rest assured knowing the soul is indestructible and in the afterlife is like a bird set free from its cage. Celsus is adamant in his writings that Christians borrowed their ideas about heaven and hell from the mysteries. He says that now the Christians pray that after their toil and strife here below, they shall enter the kingdom of heaven. And they agree with the ancient systems that there are 7 heavens and that the way of the soul is through the planets. That their system is based on very old teachings may be seen from similar beliefs in the old Persian mysteries associated with the cult of Mithras. Origen of Alexandria, also known as Origen Adamantius, was an early Christian author, ascetic, and theologian who was born and spent the first half of his career in Alexandria. Both he and the pagan sages believed in reincarnation, and that heaven and hell were merely temporary stages of reward and punishment, and that when a person died, he would experience another lifetime on earth shortly thereafter. Freke and Gandy relate that, quote, life and death were viewed as parts of a recurring circular process, not once-only events leading to eternal reward or damnation. Hell was a purgatorial experience leading to further human experience, through which every soul could make its eventual return journey to God, end quote. The Roman Catholic Church, however, did not see eye to eye with Origen on this, and he was later deemed a heretic for his belief in reincarnation. This was because the church wanted Christians to live in fear that life was a one-shot deal. Why? Because this was effective in scaring the masses into following whatever doctrines the church dictated. On this issue, Celsus has this to say: now it will be wondered how men so desperate in their beliefs can persuade others to join in their ranks. The Christians use sundry methods of persuasion and invent a number of terrifying incentives. Above all, they have concocted an absolutely offensive doctrine of everlasting punishment and rewards, exceeding anything the philosophers, who have never denied the punishment of the unrighteous or the reward of the blessed, could have imagined. Another teaching of the Roman Church was that at the end of time there would be an apocalypse of fire in which the souls of all non-believers would be burned, while faithful Christians would be physically resurrected. On this, Celsus writes, it is equally silly of these Christians to suppose that when their God applies the fire like a common cook, all the rest of mankind will be thoroughly roasted, and that they alone will escape unscorched. Not just those alive at the time, mind you, but they say that those long since dead will rise up from the earth possessing the same bodies as they did before. I ask you, is this not the hope of worms? What sort of human soul is it that has any use for a rotted corpse of a body? The very fact that some Jews and even some Christians reject this teaching about rising corpses shows just how repulsive it is. It is nothing less than nauseating and impossible. I mean, what sort of body is it that could return to its original nature or become the same as it was before it rotted away? And of course, they have no reply for this one. And as in most cases, where there is no reply, they take cover by saying nothing is impossible with God. Freke and Gandy were surprised to discover that the idea that there is one God is yet another concept that is shared by both pagans and Christians. Even though traditionally paganism has been viewed as a polytheistic religion, this is another historical distortion. Xenophanes of Colophon was a Greek philosopher, theologian, poet, and critic of religious polytheism. Xenophanes is seen as one of the most important pre-Socratic philosophers. He wrote 500 years before Jesus. There is one God, always still and at rest, who moves all things with the thought of his mind. The Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus is said to have stated, "Do you think that there are many gods? That's absurd. God is one." The pagan sage Maximus of Tyre said that the one doctrine upon which all the world is united is that one God is King of all and Father. Pythagoras also preached the belief in one God. He wrote, "God is one, and he himself does not, as some suppose, exist outside the world, but in it. he being wholly present in the entire circle and beholding all generations, being the regulating ingredient of all the ages, and the administrator of his own powers and works, the first principle in all things, the light of heaven, and father of all, the intelligence and animating soul of the universe, the movement of all orbits. Freke and Gandy also examine the views of Gnostic practitioners and compare these to those of the literalist Christians who eventually founded the Roman Catholic Church. They conclude that it was literalists who distorted the original teachings of the Gnostics, who were mystic individualists. The literalists demanded that adherents believe and have faith in the doctrines of the Church, and this was in direct opposition to the teachings of the Gnostics, who stressed the importance of directly experiencing the divine. The literalists practiced only the outer mysteries of Christianity, while the Gnostics, as the initiated ones, practiced the inner mysteries. Christian intellectuals and writers of the time of early Christianity did not see the Gnostics as insignificant heretics, though this is the picture of them that has come down to us in the modern age. On the contrary, to them, Gnosticism represented a very sophisticated form of spirituality, and it appealed to great intellectuals such as Valentinus, Basilides, Clement, and Origen. Of course, the reputation of these men was attacked and maligned by the Roman Catholic Church. Freke and Gandy conclude that the traditional history of Christianity we have been taught by the Roman Church does not account for the historical evidence. In their words, quote, "When literalist Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, it enforced its own particular view and brutally eradicated the heretics. So the traditional history of Christianity is merely the perspective of the winners in the sectarian battle between literalists and Gnostics," end quote. While the literalists portrayed Jesus as the promised Messiah, the Gnostic Jesus more resembles a hierophant of the pagan mysteries who led his followers down the road of mystical initiation into the inner mysteries. The Gnostic text, the Pistis Sophia, calls this process of initiation the mysteries of the kingdom of light. Gnostics did not see Jesus as a prophet of Jehovah, the God of the Jews, because they considered Jehovah to be the lesser God or demiurge, in contrast to the supreme God, who was an ineffable oneness beyond all qualities, which could not be described in words, an abstract and mystical God. To the Gnostics, Jehovah was subordinate to the true God and served only as his instrument. The Gnostic Jesus taught the secret traditions of true gnosis only to a small number of initiates, those who had eyes to see and ears to hear. These teachings were transmitted orally and not in writing. The inner mysteries were considered to be profoundly secret, not to be given to the uninitiated who might profane them. Origen acknowledged that both outer mysteries and inner mysteries existed in Christianity. He wrote, "The existence of certain doctrines which are beyond those which are openly taught and do not reach the multitude is not a peculiarity of Christianity only, but it is shared by the philosophers, for they had some doctrines which are exoteric and some esoteric." Freke and Gandy discovered that, according to Clement of Alexandria, Mark of the New Testament preached the gospel on 3 different levels. Each level was suited to the degree of initiation of the adherent. For example, the New Testament Gospel of Mark contains teachings appropriate for the beginner, but the secret Gospel of Mark targeted those who were being perfected or initiated into the teachings. According to Clement, the secret Gospel was a more spiritual, mystical gospel that imparted gnosis. Freke and Gandy conducted an examination of the fragments of the secret gospel which remain, and say that it was through this secret gospel that the true teachings were illuminated. The secret gospel was for those ready to understand that, for example, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is but an allegory for spiritual rebirth through initiation. Clement advises one of his students to deny the existence of the secret gospel, even under oath, for, quote, "Not all true things are to be said to all men, and the light of the truth should be hidden from those who are mentally blind," end quote. The levels of initiation, according to Freke and Gandy, were akin to the differing levels of understanding. Both pagan and Gnostic philosophical systems identified 4 levels of human identity: physical, psychological, spiritual, and mystical. The Gnostics defined these as being in the body, the counterfeit spirit, and the light power. The physical and psychological components make up the two parts of the lower self, while the spirit and light power represent the spiritual and mystical identities, the higher self, and our shared universal self. The authors characterize these levels of human identity as literal, mythical, and mystical. This is how they describe each. The literal or psychic Christian understands the story of Jesus as a historical account of a real person who died and literally was resurrected. The mythical or pneumatic Christian was initiated into the secret inner mysteries of Christianity and understood the Jesus story as an allegorical myth whose real significance was to teach the initiate about how to follow the spiritual path. And the mystical Gnostic had experienced the final baptism of fire and recognized themselves as the Christ, or universal daemon. As such, they had transcended the need for any teachings, and this included the Jesus story. The gnosis or knowledge which initiates of the pagan mysteries sought was self-knowledge. Probably the most famous representation of this is the inscription over the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, which instructs, "Know thyself, and ye shall know both the universe and the gods." The pagan mysteries taught that every human has a mortal, lower, animal self, called the eidolon, that is housed in the physical body, and an immortal, higher self, called the daemon. The pagans and the Gnostics sought to connect this higher self, or daemon, the spirit and the true self, with the one infinite source. The mysteries were all about teaching how to do this, and the first step is the realization that the lower self is the false self, while the true identity, or true self, is the daemon. In the words of Plato, we should think of the most authoritative part of the soul as a guardian spirit given by God, which lifts us to our heavenly home. Like Osiris Dionysus, to the Gnostics, Jesus symbolizes this daemon. Freke and Gandy compare these teachings to those of Jesus from the Acts of John. In this text, Jesus talks about a heavenly twin. John relates this anecdote. "When all of us, his disciples, were sleeping, I alone, having wrapped myself up, watched from under my garment what he did, and first I heard him say, 'John, go thou to sleep.' And thereupon I feigned to be asleep, and I saw another like unto him come down, whom I also heard saying to my Lord, 'Jesus, do they whom thou hast chosen still not believe in thee?' And my Lord said, 'Thou sayest well, for they are men.'" The goal of the Gnostic was to unify the lower and higher self. This is the recipe for enlightenment. Enlightenment transformed the initiate into a Gnostic, or a knower. Freke and Gandy propose that the Apostle Paul was a Gnostic. They examine his teachings and writings and discover that Paul does not preach moral servitude to the law, but instead spiritual freedom through gnosis. Paul condemns Jehovah's law as a curse. He writes, "All who depend upon works of the law are under a curse. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law." Freke and Gandy write that Paul's Jesus is the mystical, dying, and resurrecting God-man of the Gnostics, not the historical figure of the literalists, and that he taught many distinctively Gnostic doctrines. They point out that many modern scholars regard many of the letters attributed to Paul as forgeries, and this is why they question, who is the genuine Paul? They conclude he was in fact a Gnostic. In contrast, of course, to the literalist view. The attack on Gnosticism by the Roman Church was based on a premise that Gnostic teachings were closely aligned with the pagan mysteries. It is true that Gnosticism was influenced by pagan philosophy and that Gnostics encouraged its study. The library at Nag Hammadi revealed both pagan works and Christian texts. Clement of Alexandria said this about pagan philosophy: "Greek philosophy purges the soul and prepares it beforehand for the reception of faith, on which the truth builds up the edifice of gnosis." One of the greatest of all pagan philosophers was Plotinus. Plotinus was a major Hellenistic Greek philosopher born and raised in Roman Egypt, regarded by modern scholarship as the founder of Neoplatonism. His teacher was the self-taught Ammonius Saccas, who belonged to the Platonic tradition. Plotinus regarded Gnosticism as a somewhat inferior version of the pagan mysteries. He wrote that all their terminology is piled up to conceal their debt to ancient Greek philosophy. We feel a certain regard for some of our friends who happened upon this way of thinking before they became our friends, and though I do not know how they manage it, continue in it. The original Jesus mysteries, or Gnosticism, flourished especially in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. The city produced many great Gnostic teachers in the 2nd and 3rd century, including Carpocrates, Basilides, Valentinus, Clement, and Origen. Literalist Christians, however, were cut off from these masters because literalist Christians were centered in Rome itself. Christian leaders like Irenaeus had to prevent the spread of the teachings about the secret inner mysteries of Gnosticism. Perhaps the most fascinating of all the evidence presented by Freke and Gandy in support of their Jesus mysteries theory is the timeline they create that tells the story of how Christianity truly developed. They place various writings in order according to when each was promulgated. So first we have the letters of Paul, 50, Common Era. Jesus is a mystical, dying, and resurrecting God-man. Then we have the Gospel of Mark, 70 to 110 CE, where the myth of Jesus is given a historical and geographic setting. Then we have the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, 90 to 135 CE, which give details of Jesus' birth and resurrection, and those are added and the story is embellished. Then the Gospel of John, about 120 CE, Christian theology is developed. Then the Acts of the Apostles from 150 to 177 CE, having now created the illusion of a historical Jesus, Acts is created to account for his disciples. And finally, the letters of the Apostles, 177 to 220 CE. Letters attributed to Paul and the Apostles are forged by literalists in their battles with Gnosticism, attacking any deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. In summary, according to Freke and Gandy, the Gnostics did not necessarily deny the historicity of the Gospels. Instead, the Jesus story represented only the first stage in their mysteries, the stage for the uninitiated who knew only about the outer mysteries. About these exoteric Christians, Origen opines, Christ crucified is teaching for babes. He criticizes literalist Christians who cannot go beyond viewing the Jesus story as a historical fact. In his view, the goal of an initiate was to progress from faith to true gnosis. In order to accomplish this, the initiate had to experience the secret inner mysteries. Basilides wrote that those who confess Jesus as the crucified one are still enslaved to the God of the Jews. He who denies it has been freed and knows the plan of the unbegotten Father. Freke and Gandy conclude that even by their own evidence, the literalist account makes no sense. They write that there's no real evidence for the existence of Jesus the man. They searched through the records of the time and could find none. Thus, they conclude he was a mythical figure and that the traditional viewpoint of literalism is nothing but a degenerate form of the original Jesus mysteries of the Gnostics. The Gnostics believed that Jesus' death was a symbolic representation of a profound mystical truth, a triumph over one's lower self and the realization of the Christ within. They viewed the literalists as fanatical extremists who advocated pointless suffering and false promises. They proposed that after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE, the literalists, who had no use for the inner mysteries, created a historical Jesus and a limited form of Christianity, which became the Roman Catholic Church. The Gnostics, proponents of the original Jesus mysteries, were persecuted and destroyed as the literalists rejected mysticism and in its stead created a centralized authoritarian religion. Literalists saw Gnostics as heretics who stood in the way of the unification of Christianity and the Church. These literalists, in the attempt to create a centralized religion, created a limited canon of scriptures to be included in the New Testament and to exclude any Gnostic gospels while declaring them as heretical. Some of the earliest and most popular Christian texts prior to this time were the Gospel of Thomas, the Shepherd of Hernias, and the Gospel of the Hebrews. Some were purged of their heretical content and reworded into a more acceptable literalist form. The literalists came to control the church in later centuries, although originally there were many different factions vying for control. Literalist bishops claimed to be heirs to the original disciples, and this was used to create a veil of legitimacy for the church's demand for obedience. Thus, the Orthodox were successful in creating a permanent hierarchy of power, a concept the Gnostics, who were all about seeing adherents as spiritual equals, rejected. The members of the hierarchy of the church viewed the Gnostics' focus upon individualism as a dangerous threat to their authority. In the 4th century, the bishop Eusebius, church propagandist and known as the father of church history, cemented the final fictitious history of Christianity. Eusebius, in his attempt to gain favor with the Emperor Constantine, declared that the emperor was the voice of Christ on earth. He provided Roman Christianity with a suitable history, and as it turns out, had little regard for the truth. He is quoted as an authority on Christian history, primarily because his account alone survived the first 3 centuries, and subsequently it has been adopted by all church historians since that time. Needless to say, Eusebius accuses the Gnostics of being heretics. In order to create legitimacy for his narrative, he presents apostolic lines of succession which link the literalist bishops back to the disciples of Jesus. He presents no evidence or proof for this, however, either than to say he is building upon the idea presented earlier, probably by Irenaeus, who also attacked the Gnostics. In addition, he invents stories about the original Christians for which there is no proof. In a word, he created a history of Christianity to please a tyrannical Roman emperor, Constantine, and he based his work on a tradition of deceit and forgery. This, Freke and Gandy conclude, is the history of Christianity that most modern people believe to be true. Of course, in so doing, both Gnostic and pagan teachings had to be discredited and destroyed. In 415 AD, Archbishop Cyril of Alexandria, who was made a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, had his monks incite a Christian mob to murder the last pagan scientist at the Alexandrian library. Her name was Hypatia, and during the attack the mob tore her limb from limb. Pagan writings were burned and temples were closed. One witness reported that the great books of pagan spirituality were heaped onto huge bonfires. The witness said that innumerable books were piled together, many heaps of volumes drawn from various houses to be burnt under the eyes of the judges as prohibited. Owners burnt their entire libraries, so great was the terror that seized everyone. These works and the knowledge and wisdom they contained were lost. Within a few decades of Christianity, the wonders and achievements of antiquity were destroyed. In a similar fashion, Gnosticism was crushed. The Roman Emperor Theodosius passed over 100 laws against the Gnostics, declaring their beliefs and meetings illegal. In 381, he made heresy a crime against the state, and all philosophical debate over Gnostic ideas was forbidden. Their writings were destroyed and burned. One decree in the 5th century, on behalf of Archbishop Cyril of Alexandria, proclaimed to heretics that I shall make you acknowledge the Archbishop Cyril, or else the sword will wipe out most of you, and moreover, those of you who are spared will go into exile. Augustine, declared St. Augustine by the Roman Catholic Church, stated that military force was necessary to suppress heretics for their own good. He said, "Filled with fear myself, I fill you with fear." With that, say Freke and Gandy, St. Paul's spirituality of love and gnosis had become the Roman Church's religion of obedience and terror. Christianity, a doctrine that began with a message of freedom and equality, ended up creating a reign of authoritarian terror. The authors declare that the destruction of paganism is the greatest tragedy ever suffered by the Western world. They end with this question: if paganism was so primitive and literalist Christianity the one true religion, why was pagan civilization replaced by the 1,000 years we appropriately call the Dark Ages?